Grace Howard is an assistant professor of justice studies at San Jose State University. She earned her PhD in political science at Rutgers University. Her new book, The Pregnancy Police: Conceiving Crime, Arresting Personhood, is under contract with the University of California Press, and the manuscript has been handed over to the publisher. Woo, woo, woo. Professor Howard has authored several published works, the most recent of which is entitled The Pregnancy Police: Surveillance, Regulation, and Control in Harvard Law and Policy Review. I'm pretty sure I'm having my women and gender class read that article. They're reading one of your articles later this semester.
Cool.
Professor Howard's body of work explores reproductive law and policy through the lens of reproductive justice and the dimensions of legal personhood for people with the capacity for pregnancy. She has appeared in print and television news outlets, including BBC News, MSNBC, Telemundo, Huffington Post, and Rolling Stone. And it seems like all the time Grace is on the news, especially since this has been in the news so much. Before graduate school, she worked as a birth doula and as a handholder at an abortion clinic. All right, take it away, Grace.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's nice to be back here at USI. This is where my very first professor job was. So I'm here to talk to you about my research. And as Professor Lynn said, I like literally turned in the manuscript for this book last week. So a lot of the stuff that I'll be sharing with you is brand new, stuff that I've just found. One note on language use. So you'll notice that I refer to people with the capacity for pregnancy. That's my go-to. And there are some reasons for this. So yes, cisgender women, some of them are people who can get pregnant. Not all of them are. Right. But also cisgender women are not the only people who can get pregnant. And so using terms that are broader, it does two things for me. One, it is more reflective of the reality, right? That queer people, that non-binary people, that trans men are capable of pregnancy. And it also does something that's really central to my argument, which it situates pregnant people as a legal class. And I'm arguing that that is something that essentially through law and policy, the US government has already done, that pregnant people are considered a legal class, and that when you are pregnant, you lose a whole bunch of what would otherwise be considered fundamental rights. All right, so you'll notice me using that language, and I just wanted you to know why. This project is called the Pregnancy Police. And it rests on this concept that I developed called pregnancy exceptionalism. So this is when pregnant people lose their rights because of their pregnancies, because they are pregnant. And we see this in a whole bunch of arenas. We see it a lot in medicine, for example. So in general, competent adults have a right to reject a course of medical treatment, even if it might mean they die. As a result, pregnant people can lose this right. Right, and I'll show you a few examples of that. So this is really broad. My project narrows in on it and looks at pregnancy-specific crime and what pregnancy exceptionalism means when it hits the war on drugs, essentially. So just to give you some examples, what I'm talking about when I say pregnancy exceptionalism, I want to talk you through some real life cases. So this is Angela Carter, who is now deceased. When she was 13 years old, she was diagnosed with some really complex cancers. And, she beat them. She was in remission. She had lost some of her limbs, but she got married, as you can see her lovely wedding picture. And she was pregnant with a wanted pregnancy and, so excited for the future. And then unfortunately, the cancer came back. And we know that in part because of all of the estrogen that your body is making when you're pregnant, cancer kind of loves estrogen. And so it might have even been the pregnancy that contributed to her cancer coming back. So, Angela, the cancer was really aggressive, and it became clear that she probably wasn't going to survive this time, that she was going to lose this battle. But she was very pregnant, and she wanted to try to bring this pregnancy to term. She cared very much about that. So she was, working things out with her doctor, and her health just really deteriorated very quickly. So she was on She had a feeding tube. She wasn't able to really speak, but she was aware of what was going on, and she was able to tell them what she wanted to happen. What she really wanted was to be given treatment that would allow her to survive long enough to give birth to a live baby. She hadn't quite reached that moment of viability where the pregnancy could survive outside of her own body. And she just wanted the doctors to give her that if they could, to do whatever they could to sustain her body for a few more weeks so that she could give birth and maybe her baby would survive. But that's not what happened. So her doctor was on board. Her doctor wanted to help her with this plan. But some like rando in the hallway at the hospital heard what was going on. And basically they cut Angela open without her permission, against her will. She explicitly stated she did not want to have this forced cesarean section. The thinking here was that the treatment that Angela would receive to sustain her life could itself be bad for a fetus, a developing fetus. And so they got a lawyer to intervene. Angela was given a forced cesarean section. It killed her. She was not strong enough to live through that. Her baby died too. Her baby lived for just a couple of hours, and Angela died a couple days later because of the cesarean. Right now, if she had been someone who was not pregnant, that never would have happened. She's a competent adult, right? She gets to say yes or no to medical treatment. But because she was pregnant, this very old, institutionalized, fundamental right was taken away, right? And it's only because of the fact of her pregnancy that that happened. In this case, it literally killed her. This is Alicia Beltran. This is a case from Wisconsin. So Alicia Beltran was pregnant with a unwanted pregnancy. When she was very early in her pregnancy, she struggled with substance dependency. But once she realized she was pregnant, she quit using. She was, didn't need any kind of treatment. She was good to go, and she was getting her prenatal care and was happy to be, having a drug-free pregnancy. But in Wisconsin, there is this law that allows healthcare providers to move to have someone detained against their will if they are pregnant and found to be habitually out of control. So what happened was Alicia told her nurse that she had had a problem with drugs in the past, but that she wasn't facing this issue anymore, that she had beat it on her own. The nurse didn't see any formal drug treatment, though, in her medical record. And so the nurse assumed that Alicia still did have a drug problem, even though she was, testing negative for drugs. And so they moved to have Alicia committed against her will. She was held away from her family, away from her job. She received no prenatal care while she was being held. She was essentially in a inpatient drug treatment facility, and she was put on medication-assisted treatment, which is a great thing if you do actively have substance dependency, but Alicia didn't, right? So she was being forced to take additional drugs that she didn't even need. All of this is supposed to be to protect her fetus, right? They're saying Alicia can't protect her fetus, she's out of control, and so we need to do something about it. The state needs to do something about it. Something that's so interesting to me about this case is that they're the criminal justice system to do this. This is all happening through the civil system. This is the child protective system, right? And so she doesn't get an attorney appointed for her. You only get that in the criminal system. The fetus gets an attorney. The fetus has a guardian ad litem appointed to represent its interests, right? It also, because it's happening in the civil system and not the criminal justice system, Alicia doesn't get to have a jury. It's not a public trial, right? So she's really put at a disadvantage here. And she's arguably put in a very dangerous situation that was bad for her pregnancy. But even if it had been good for her pregnancy, this idea that to protect your pregnancy, they can hold your body against your will, That's not something that happens to other people, right? That's not something that happens, right? If they take your fetus into protective custody, that means you are forced to go along with it. And this is, a rights deprivation that only happens to pregnant people. Here's another example. This is Laura Pemberton. This is a case from Florida. So Laura is conservative. She calls herself pro-life. She's had a bunch of babies, and she'd had a cesarean section. And I don't know if any of y'all have had a C-section. It is an intense surgery, right? It is a routine surgery, but it is intense. They have to cut through your abdominal wall. Recovery is significant. Some people never fully recover from a surgery. It also makes it hard to take care of your newborn, right? You're not supposed to lift anything after you've had a C-section, and it's just a whole thing. So Laura really wanted to try to have a vaginal birth with this last pregnancy. She really wanted to try to have a vaginal birth, and she couldn't find a doctor willing to work with her on that. The standard is, and I can explain in the Q&A later if you're curious why, if you've had one cesarean section, that every subsequent birth is going to be done through a cesarean section. That's like kind of medical standard right now, even though it maybe shouldn't be. So Laura couldn't find a doctor that would work with her. So she found a midwife that would, and she gave birth at home. She was laboring at home with her midwife. And she told the midwife, look, like, I care about my baby a lot, my fetus, this future baby. If anything goes wrong, cut me open, do anything you have to do to save this baby, right? Just like, maybe don't cut me open unless you really have to, and then you can cut me open. That's not what happened for Laura, though. So Laura was laboring. It was a tough labor, but she was doing okay. There was no indication that the fetus was ever in any danger. But Laura did become a little dehydrated during the labor, and so she went to the hospital, but just to receive IV fluids. The hospital's attorney found out that she was there, and the hospital attorney got a judge to issue a court order ordering Laura to have a cesarean section against her will. So Laura fled the hospital. Again, she's in labor, y'all. She flees the hospital. She's like, oh my gosh, they're gonna cut me open. They send the cops after her. They arrest her at her home. Her legs are shackled together while she's in labor, and she is transported to a hospital where she's cut open against her will. She's sued, right? She says, hey, I'm a competent adult. I'm saying no C-section. There was never any fetal distress, right? This was just a perfunctory, like, we're supposed to cut you open kind of a move. And so she argued that her constitutional rights had been violated. But the Florida Supreme Court disagreed with her. They said that, Laura doesn't care about the fetus, and so we have to protect the fetus. That's what we did here, right? The Florida Supreme Court essentially said, if you are pregnant, you don't have the right to reject a course of medical treatment. If you're pregnant, you can be cut open against your will, kind of at any time, and you can be arrested for stuff that's not even considered a crime. Here's another case. This one comes from Texas. This is Marlise Munoz. Marlise was an EMT, and she was pregnant with her second baby. And this was a wanted pregnancy. She was like very excited to be pregnant. But Marlise had an aneurysm. Her husband found her unconscious on the kitchen floor one night, and they brought her to the hospital, and unfortunately, it had been too long. Her brain had been deprived of oxygen for too long, and she would never regain function of her brain. So she's, persistent vegetative state. Lisa's pregnant though. So what happens when you're pregnant and you're brain dead? It varies by state. So there are these things called advance directives. And if you have any preference about what happens to you when, if hopefully it never happens, but if you're ever brain dead or in a persistent vegetative state or something like this, you can actually specify right now what you would want to happen to you in the event that something like that went down. And Marlise had done that, right? She works in the medical field. She's an EMT. So she's seeing people all the time, dying and being like severely brain damaged, right? And so she's got an advance directive, and it's clear she does not want to be kept on life support. She wants them to let her body die. So she did have an advance directive. The problem is, in a good handful of states, if you are pregnant, you lose your right to have a advance directive. This is like, it's a very state by state thing. There are some kind of different levels of it, of how it would work. But so Marlise was kept on life support against her will and against her family's will for over 60 days. They were going to try to bring her, I believe, like early second trimester pregnancy to term in her brain dead body. This is experimental. It's pretty rare for this to happen, and we do not have practice of supporting bodies while they are gestating a pregnancy and they're technically dead. Her body was deteriorating. You can read accounts of this. It's really horrifying what was happening. She smelled like a dead body. When her mom tried to hold her hand, her fingers like had gone into rigor and they were like snapping, like awful. Marlise was eventually taken off life support, but only because of a technicality. So it turns out in Texas, pregnant people, you don't have the right to have an advance directive, but it only counts for people who are in like a persistent vegetative state and not for people who are actually brain dead. And Marlise was actually brain dead, which is why they eventually did take her off life support. She's not the only person this has happened to. This is just to kind of show you, if you're pregnant, even after you're like technically dead, you don't have the same rights as other people. You have fewer rights than other similarly situated people. So those are some examples of pregnancy exceptionalism in the medical field, for example. But we also see this in criminal law, and that's really what my focus is on. So when we see pregnancy exceptionalism and criminal law, there's, I think, something very powerful sociological happening here. That like, yes, maybe you have someone who has perhaps violated a criminal law or is perceived to have violated a criminal law, but you also have someone who is violating expectations about appropriate femininity, about what mothers are supposed to be like, right? This idea that mothers, you're inherently nurturing. It's a natural biological thing that you don't care about yourself ever. You only care about your fetus or your fertilized egg or your embryo or your child. And, that your love for your child is somehow able to overcome any obstacle, including stuff like violence, including stuff like substance dependency, including stuff like depression, right? So there are two violations happening here. One is legal, and the other one is like a gender violation, right? Like girls aren't supposed to be like that, is kind of the idea. So I looked at all state laws defining pregnancy-specific crimes or pregnancy-related crimes, and I developed a typology of pregnancy-related crime. So the first is laws that criminalize third-party harm against fertilized eggs, embryos, or fetuses. And I'll go through some examples of these. The second type are laws criminalizing harm against a pregnant person, not against the fetus, but about the pregnant person themselves as like a special class of victim. We do this for police officers. We also do this for sports referees, interestingly. The third is criminalizing abortion, something we will be seeing more and more of, I'm afraid. And then fourth are laws that criminalize a pregnant person's activities or lack of activities or behaviors with regard to their own pregnancy. These are the four types that we have so far. So I talk about this peril of protection. There's this idea that we need to protect certain kinds of pregnant people from violence, especially domestic violence. And then we use these very same kind of protective laws to open the door to punishing pregnant people, right, for crimes against their own pregnancies. So, here's an example of that. So some of you might be familiar with this case. It's not too far away from where I live now, in California. This was in Modesto, California. This is Lacey Peterson. So, she was in her 8th month of pregnancy when she went missing on Christmas Eve. Her husband was eventually convicted of murdering her. And this murder case, I mean, it got so much press attention. It was everywhere. Part of it is because it was kind of a slow news day, like Christmas time, right? But part of it is because she's like pretty. This is a nice middle-class couple. Her husband was like handsome, right? And so it's really, people were really worried about this like very nice seeming white woman who was missing for a long time, who was about to pop. I mean, she was like ready to give birth, right? When she goes missing. After her death and after, the case is solved, there's some question about whether or not her husband actually did it. But this inspired a federal law, and it also inspired a whole bunch of state laws that went to define fertilized eggs, embryos, or fetuses as crime victims, right? So this would mean that if you murder someone like Lacey, who's pregnant, that you would face a penalty for murdering a person, typical, right? But you would also face a penalty or a separate charge for harming the fetus as its own independent victim. These kinds of laws use this reality that domestic violence is one of the leading causes of death for pregnant people as a reason to essentially establish fetal personhood in the criminal code. And once you have fetal personhood in the criminal code, you can like put it in a whole bunch of other places. This is something that we have seen. So, we pass laws, we need to protect Lacey, and, she was going to name the son Connor. So the federal law is, the nickname for it is Lacey and Connor's law. Going to protect these nice middle-class white ladies. And we're going to punish these bad women, these bad moms. And this is something that we have seen happen. So, the road goes from that first law typology, criminalizing third-party harm. We establish fetal personhood. And then once the fetus is considered a person, we can punish the very pregnant people that are growing and gestating these pregnancies. So this woman's name is Heather Capps. This is a case from Alabama. That's her sweet, fat, cute baby. She had a healthy baby. But Heather Capps was 25 years old, and she was addicted to oxycodone. She'd had a back injury and had been prescribed the drug. And then she became pregnant. She wanted to give birth to this baby. She didn't want to have an abortion. She had 2 little boys at home, and she wanted to have a healthy pregnancy. She'd also heard about this new policy in Alabama where they were using this law. It's called chemical endangerment of a minor. It was a new criminal penalty, a new criminal charge, where essentially they were really freaked out about meth labs. And they were worried that people would have like their toddlers hanging around in their like trailer park meth lab or whatever. And so they passed this law. If you have a child in an environment where drugs are used or manufactured, or where there's drug paraphernalia or any number of things, that you're guilty of felony child abuse. And they started using this law to punish pregnant people who tested positive for drugs. Right? Even though the law said nothing about pregnancy or fetuses or anything like that, they started using it that way. And Heather Heather'd heard of this. So, she didn't want to get in trouble. She wanted to have a healthy pregnancy, but she's a single mom and she has 2 little boys at home that she needs to take care of. She's looking for drug treatment, but the only place she can get a referral to is like an hour and a half away. She doesn't have anyone to watch after her little boys. So she can't do it. It's not workable for her. So she's tapering down the drug use on her own, right? To get to the lowest dose possible. She wants to have a healthy baby. She doesn't want to get in trouble. And there's no other help for her. There's nothing. So she gives birth to this, gorgeous baby. He's totally healthy. And she's arrested at the hospital just a couple days after giving birth. She's put in suicide watch because she'd had an overdose previously that was on her medical record. And a lot of prisons and jails count an overdose as a suicide attempt. Even if it wasn't, they'll count it as one. So, she's just had a cesarean section. Her milk has come in and it's leaking out of her boobs. And she's got this big abdominal wound. And she's in suicide watch, which some of you may know, you're naked in there because you can hurt yourself with your clothing. Okay. So her vagina's bleeding, her boobs are leaking. Her newborn has been taken away from her. So she's completely distraught. And she's alone and naked in this horrible little cell. That is what Heather had to go through. She was unable to post $500,000 bond, and she spent 6 months in jail, just seeing what the next steps would be. Eventually, she was given a sentence. She needed to do drug court. They sent her to a halfway house, right? So for her to get the treatment she wanted and needed and was asking for, she had to take a guilty plea to a class C felony child abuse, right? All of that bad stuff happened to someone who was actively seeking help with her drug problem. And it happened because she was pregnant. I'm wondering if any of you have ever had to take a drug test. I have. Usually it's for employment. For me, it's usually for like the worst jobs I ever had. Like when I was like a line cook at a bar, they like really wanted to drug test my pee. So what happens if you fail a drug test? Do they call the cops on you? You get put in a jail cell? Do they take your babies away from you immediately? A single positive drug test? That's not how that's supposed to work, right? So we have medical privacy, right? Healthcare providers are not supposed to be able to report this kind of information to law enforcement. But if you're pregnant, they will. They say they're doing it to protect a fetus. Sometimes they even think of themselves, they're like, this is part of mandated reporting. We can debate that. It's arguably not part of mandated reporting, right? They say, hey, if the fetus is a person, a child, and I'm supposed to report abuse of children, and I view drug use as a form of abuse, then I'm calling the cops on you. That's what happened to Heather. And that's what has happened to thousands of other people throughout the United States. So this most recent iteration of the study, I updated all my data. I have a little over 1,100 cases of confirmed arrests of pregnant people for crimes against their own pregnancies. And this is only from 3 states, South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. These are the 3 states that ever like made it official that you could treat a pregnant person this way. But I can tell you right now, this is not just a Southern thing at all. These kinds of arrests have happened in every state but Vermont and Delaware. So yeah, it's happening all over. I can also tell you, if you look at this number and you think that's a lot of cases, it is almost definitely way more than that. For a whole bunch of reasons, it is hard to track these cases down. And so almost certainly this is an undercount. It's happening a lot more than we even know. So I analyzed all of these cases. It's like many, many hundreds of thousands of pages of court case materials. And I coded them for a bunch of stuff, found a lot of interesting things, and I'll just share kind of some of these interesting things with you. So people were arrested for all kinds of things. It was mostly for using drugs during pregnancy, but also there were arrests made for self-managed abortion. One person was arrested for not taking good care of herself during pregnancy. There were a couple cases, you were charged with abuse of a corpse. These were cases where people had miscarriages at home and they didn't bring the products of conception, the fetus, the placenta, all that stuff to like the coroner or the hospital afterwards. I can tell you right now, like a lot of miscarriages, if you have them early, which is when most of them are, it is indistinguishable from a period. It's like a heavy period, like a heavy menstrual period. I don't know at what point in a pregnancy someone is legally required to bring their fetus to the coroner. It is not specified in any law, right? But this person had a miscarriage, didn't bring the fetus to the coroner, and got charged for abuse of a corpse. She buried the fetus in her backyard. There were a couple cases where people survived suicide attempts and then were charged. Some people were charged with crimes when they rejected medical advice. There were a few car accident related charges. Most of them were drugs, like I said. There was a case where someone was charged for failing to protect her fetus from third-party harm, so someone who did harm to her, and she's the one who got in trouble for it. And then there was another case where someone was charged because they were running from the police while they were pregnant. So they got, you would expect someone who's trying to evade police to get some kind of "you're trying to evade the police" type of charges. But in this case, they tagged on an additional charge of reckless endangerment of a child because she was pregnant while she was literally running. And here are some of those, examples of criminal cases. So I wanted to give you some Indiana cases. These ones aren't necessarily included in my study states, but they're illustrative of what's going on. So this is Bebe Shui. Bebe, she's a Chinese immigrant. She was in her third trimester when her boyfriend left her. It was like the coldest, darkest day of the year. It was like deep in the winter, and Bebe had struggled with depression anyway. And, now she's abandoned this man who said he was going to marry her and that she's having this baby with. He's just abandoned her. So, she's devastated and she tries to end her life. And she ingests rat poison. She takes rat poison, but she survives, and she goes to the hospital and she tells them, do whatever you can to save my baby. She has an emergency C-section, but her baby doesn't live. Her baby dies. So Bebe is charged with feticide. It's a homicide charge, and she is not given bond. So she's stuck in jail, and she sits in jail for a full year waiting for trial. She eventually takes a plea. Pleads guilty to a lesser charge, and she's given credit for time served, and she's released. But she was facing a homicide charge. It's like decades in prison potentially for Bebe. I don't have an image of Gabriella's face, but this is another example. So this is from South Carolina. Gabriella was a migrant farm worker. She was making like $1 an hour or something obscene, working at farms. And she was 22 years old, and she had 3 children. 2 of them were still in Mexico. 1 of them was with her in South Carolina. And she was trying to earn money to send back home to support her kids. And she thought she could make more in the States. Gabriella became pregnant. We don't know who she got pregnant with, but she was pregnant and she knew she couldn't support another kid. I mean, she was just barely making it, and she's so young. And so her sister mailed her abortion pills. Her sister lived in Mexico, where you can get abortion pills over the counter. It's called Cytotec. It's an ulcer medication, and it is also like part of the FDA approved cocktail of drugs that will end your pregnancy. And so she could have gone north to North Carolina to have a legal abortion there, but it would have cost around $700, and she's just not making enough money to ever be able to pay for that in time. So she takes the pills that her sister mailed her. She's 16 weeks pregnant, and she, miscarries. She loses the pregnancy. She buries the fetus in the backyard, and her neighbor got word of what was happening. And her neighbor reported her to the cops. So the cops came and they found the fetus, and they tried to get the death penalty for Gabriella. Eventually they dropped that. They couldn't do it, but they were going to try to have her executed for doing something that would have been legal if she had been 1 state north. There's a bunch of other kind of weird stuff from her case we can talk about in the Q&A if you want. This is, just one example, this self-managed abortion, and she's potentially facing murder charges and, being executed by the state of South Carolina. This is Purvi Patel. This is another Indiana case. So Purvi had a miscarriage late in her pregnancy, and she had expressed some uncertainty about this unplanned pregnancy, and she talked about getting abortion pills, but there's no proof that she took them. So she lost her pregnancy while she was working at her parents' restaurant, and She wrapped the fetus up and she put it in a dumpster, and she was bleeding really badly. So she went to the hospital for help, and some rando in the hallway, again with these randos, like heard about her case, went and fetched the fetus out of the dumpster. They used all of these like bunk, non-scientific forensics to say that she had given birth to a live baby and then neglected it until death. They also argued, though, that she had caused the miscarriage intentionally, which, like, it can only be one of those things. Either the baby came out of you and it was alive, or the baby came out of you and it wasn't alive. It can only be one. This is not a twin pregnancy, right? But Purvey was convicted of this, of ending this life one way or another, and she was given 2 decades long sentence. She eventually got out on a technicality, but like they were willing to put her away for decades for what, as far as we know and what there is evidence for, was a natural miscarriage. And this is Marche Jones. This is an Alabama case. So Marche, she was 5 months pregnant, or 5 or 6 months pregnant, when she got in a fight with another woman who was now dating the father of Marche's baby. And this other woman pulled out a gun and shot Marche in the belly, ending the pregnancy. And Marche was charged. The gunshot victim was charged. They said that Marche had instigated the fight. They say that Marche was acting recklessly and that she was to blame for having been shot in the abdomen. This is another case where, it got national attention and it was an outrage, but she spent months in this process of like not sure if she's going to be getting like a homicide charge or something, right? For when someone else shot her in the belly. We see this with born children a lot. If you have a child and your husband is abusing you and the kid, and you fail to protect that kid, even if you're an abuse victim yourself, you're like literally unable to protect your kid because you're in danger too. They charge moms with that kind of thing. And so in this case, they just applied it to, a fetus. But like I said, most of them were drug cases. And for this, we have to go back to this myth of the crack baby. And this is from the 80s. There's this idea that this is a very racist thing too, that Black moms don't care about their babies. They're taking drugs just for fun. And they are giving birth to these defective, inherently violent children that are going to like ruin America. I mean, this is really what the narrative was like. You see just like crying children on the front of Time magazine and stuff. Here's a quote from Representative George Miller. "These children, who are the most expensive babies ever born in America, are going to overwhelm every social service delivery system they come in contact with throughout the rest of their lives." So a lot of the arrests that happened first were of Black women for using crack cocaine. In South Carolina, almost exclusively, they were arresting Black women who tested positive for crack, usually late in the pregnancy or while they were giving birth, they were getting drug tested. And we repeated this same fully unsubstantiated panic again in the early 2000s with the meth panic, meth babies. And we're kind of doing it right now with the opioid epidemic. Oxytots are what they're called sometimes. So there's these like 3 periods of racialized drug panic. Crack racialized as a black people drug. Meth racialized as like a poor white people drug, and oxy too. It's kind of seen as like, I guess oxy is seen as like a working class white people drug, and meth is seen as like a poor white trash drug, right? So we have these panics that are happening anyway, but it seems that when you bring pregnancy into the fray, it amplifies the panic even more. There are these images of pregnancy-specific harm that are either completely false, which is the case for crack babies, or that are super overblown, which is the case for meth babies and for oxytots. I don't know. We can talk about the medicine of this in the Q&A, though I'm not a doctor, that kind of doctor anyway. But just to say that like pregnancy outcomes are never 100% in our control. You can do everything right during a pregnancy and have a pregnancy loss, and you can do everything wrong, quote unquote, and give birth to a healthy baby. It's virtually impossible to determine the cause of a specific pregnancy outcome. And there are way worse things for a pregnancy than prenatal substance use. And I would add like specifically prenatal illicit substance use. There are a bunch of legal medications that can be really bad for pregnancy, right? So yeah, say, I'm not telling you to go smoke crack while you're pregnant, but like there's worse you can do than smoking crack while you're pregnant. Birth outcomes, I tracked the birth outcomes in these cases. Almost all the cases where they specified a birth outcome, it was a healthy baby. 682 cases. 89 cases were complicated births, usually premature or babies that they said were having withdrawals. Miscarriage or stillbirth happened in 77 cases. 11 arrest cases involved multiples. So, you know, get ready to like roll the dice on your criminal case, because if you're pregnant with twins, you're going to get twice the charges. Right? If you're pregnant with triplets, which there was one triplet pregnancy, you're going to get 3 times the charges. 208 cases involved people who were still pregnant when they were arrested. And the earliest of those was 6 weeks after your last menstrual period, AKA 2 weeks after a missed period. So most people don't even know they're pregnant yet. It's very early. 17 arrests happened in the first trimester. How do people get caught? People are the way you get caught. Other people report them. It's healthcare providers most of the time. It's doctors and nurses reporting on you, but also social workers making reports, friends, family, neighbors making reports. Other forms of evidence can be used after the fact. I've seen a Facebook pregnancy announcement used as evidence that someone was aware of their pregnancy, for example. You know, and this could potentially include period trackers, texts, emails, search history. But before you like freak out and delete your period tracker, it's usually going to be a human, right? And then they'll use this other stuff as supporting evidence. So what you really need to do is like be careful who you talk to if you want to avoid getting caught. Sources of information for the cops: 75% of arrests were made after healthcare reporters or healthcare providers reported them. I found over 100 hospitals or clinics involved in this. 96 cases resulted from criminal investigation for other crimes. So like you were driving weird and they pulled you over and they drug tested you, or they did a breathalyzer and then they saw your big belly, something like that. 30 cases came from probation issued drug tests. 9 cases were brought after drug tests issued by social services. There was 1 case that involved a Facebook pregnancy announcement. And then another case where a crisis pregnancy center gave all this information over to the cops. And the people at crisis pregnancy centers aren't healthcare providers, so they are bound by like no ethical obligations at all. How it works in general is drug test, report, arrest, prosecution. So it involves healthcare providers essentially doing the work of detectives, right? It like turns healthcare providers into cops. They're doing this evidence collection for them. I want to have enough time for like Q&A. So I'm going to some things. I did see definitively evidence that people were avoiding healthcare because of these criminal penalties, which if you want healthy pregnancies and healthy moms is not the way to go, right? So people were giving fake names or even offering false IDs at the hospital. Some people left the hospital without their newborns just like hours after giving birth, which is so intense and sad. Some people withheld knowledge of their pregnancy from the jail if they got arrested for some other thing. It's like, why tell them I'm pregnant? Yeah, maybe they'll give me a prenatal vitamin, but they might also add on a felony charge. So like, what do we do? And then a good number of people also gave birth outside of healthcare settings to avoid detection. So at home or in motels. One person tried to flee the state to give birth somewhere where they wouldn't charge her with a felony. And she ended up giving birth on the side of the highway. Sentences, they ranged from no time in prison with like mandated drug court or drug treatment to up to 20 years in prison is what I found. Some people were also ordered to be sterilized as a condition of bond or for plea bargains. So, you know, what about Dobbs? Right now, all this stuff I've just told you about, all of it happened while abortion was still a constitutional right. And now it's not. So we can expect all of it to get worse. We've seen, I mean, you might be familiar with some of this. The Black maternal mortality rate is like on the rise like crazy. People are forced to have abortions later in pregnancy because they simply can't access it early. And we're seeing all of these examples of pregnant folks being denied quality care for other stuff like cancer. Georgia has fetal personhood now is the law in Georgia, right? All kinds of stuff. And it could get so much worse than that. What can we do? Voting is a good idea. And not just for president, right? It's voting all the way down the line. Who's going to be your local prosecutor? Who's deciding whether or not to charge you with these pregnancy crimes? That's in a lot of places something you vote on. We need to build alliances. There are connections between reproductive justice and racial justice, environmentalism, queer rights, prison abolition, housing, birthing justice, all of these kinds of things that are very clearly connected to reproductive justice, right? And so those are like perfect places to start building coalitions. We can also fundraise for abortion access. You don't need to give your money to Planned Parenthood. They have plenty of money. You should definitely give your money to independent abortion funds because they're the ones who do the heavy lifting in terms of making sure people can get care. Join a practical support network for abortion seekers. If you don't have one in your area, you can start one. This basically involves giving people a ride to the clinic, making sure they have a safe place to stay. If you're self-managing an abortion, you don't want to do that alone. You want to have someone safe with you and you want to have a safe place to do it. You can sign up for that. Talk to your people, the people who you care about, who you respect, who are in your life. Make sure they know that this matters to you and make sure they understand why. And then if you are someone who's had an abortion, share your story. Abortion is totally normal and like a lot of people have them. It's just weird how stigmatized it is and we pretend like it's not happening when it is like such a common experience. And if we can share our stories, that is hugely stigma busting. So if you feel safe and if you are ready, share your story. Thank you so much for this talk. I do mindful of time, but I want to field questions. What questions you have for me? We've got this QR code to give feedback on the event, and then we've also got this other code to help you with voting information. Make sure you're registered to vote, and you know what they say: make a plan for voting. It's don't just show up at the polls and be like, what do I do? Make a plan before you go. Figure out who you're going to vote for, right? This is all kind of proactive stuff we can do. That's what I have for you. And now I guess Q&A time.
All right, thank you so much, Grace. That was really illuminating. I learned so much. So I'm Dr. Sellerest. I'm part of the Q&A team. So if you guys have a Q&A or question, just put it here in the Q&A in the bottom right corner. But I'll start. One question that I have, I'm a historian and interested in the past. So can you tell me how far back does your study go?
So the bracket of years where I was looking for cases was from Roe v. Wade forward. And the earliest one that I found from our 3 study states was from 1986. It was a Tennessee case. And this was a case where someone had a miscarriage and they blamed her for it. And so she got a like criminal abortion charge, right? So like even if abortion is a constitutional right, the states started passing all of these limits on like what kinds of abortions are allowed and which kinds aren't. And one of the biggest ones, and one that many states have, is a law regulating who is allowed to provide an abortion. And so, you know, she wasn't a physician, right? It's usually limited to physicians, but it should probably not be. Nurse practitioners should be allowed to do first trimester abortions because they're like not complicated. But yeah, that's the earliest one. I think it's the earliest one that we have on record, right? And we know that people were getting prosecuted for this kind of stuff before Roe v. Wade. But yeah, 86 is the earliest I found.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. And I know that you were talking about, examining your data. I obviously haven't seen your book yet. I'm anxiously awaiting. But were there any years where it was like, did you look at it, like year by year? Were there any years where it was particularly like, blowing up or?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's like a really weird process where it's very localized. So like some counties are participating and others aren't. And like maybe it slowly spreads throughout the state, but then, one super gung-ho prosecutor finds a job in the state legislature and, and it stops doing the prosecution. So it's kind of all over the place. But the trajectory is up overall. I do have some graphs. The trajectory is way up. They are only going up. Tennessee adopted its law. Its law was only on the books for 2 years, like 2014 through 2016, which is weird for a criminal law. It was passed with like a built-in expiration date. Bizarre. We like don't do that with criminal law, but I guess this time we did. And weirdly, the arrests peaked in like 2012 in Tennessee. So there's also something happening where like, how much does the law actually matter when people are just, prosecutors and cops are just doing what they want and judges are letting them? Like, it's weird. But even as we have seen overall drug arrests on the decline, pregnancy related arrests are up and up and up. And, now we should expect it to explode, honestly.
How alarming. Thank you.
I guess I'm seeing some in the Q&A.
Yeah. I was just going to get there. So one person asked, what new laws are already on the horizon post Dobbs, and what is in the works going forward?
Like, it's sort of like what they say with porn. Like, if you can imagine it, porn of it probably exists. And it's kind of the same way with these pregnancy laws. Like, if you can imagine it, somebody's probably trying to propose it into law. I think a federal ban on abortion is a real possibility, right? Right now, it was kicked back to the states. So states can do whatever they want. So if Indiana wants no abortions, but California wants abortions for everybody, we could do that. If the Republicans take Congress and the presidency, I think a federal ban is probable. I think fetal personhood is definitely a possibility. On the state level, I definitely see trying to limit the ability of pregnant people to cross state lines as a possibility, for sure. And then we should be expecting just more and more weird, arbitrary, this many weeks ban or this many weeks ban, for sure. However, it's all doom and gloom, right? Some states are being really proactive. So there are some measures to be voted on that would help enshrine abortion rights in state constitutions. I believe Michigan has one of these coming up, Prop 3. Right, California has been passing some laws explicitly to say you can't charge pregnant people with these crimes, right? So that's happening too. But yeah, on the whole, now that Dobbs is gone, I think we should expect to see like a lot of weird new stuff popping up. And there are like advocacy groups that write, it's cookie cutter legislation, right? So they'll write, they did this with like the idea of abortion reversal, not a thing, not a possibility, not possible. But an advocacy group writes a piece of legislation that's basically like Mad Libs, where you like fill in your state, like fill in your state here, and then the rest is identical. They've done that with abortion law for decades now. And so, yeah, we'll see some of that kind of policy diffusion happening almost definitely.
Thank you. There's another question here. What's something you discovered during your research that you wish you knew previously?
I mean, when I read that question, the thing that jumped out to me first was like, this whole thing, like, I was in grad school and I considered myself really knowledgeable about reproductive rights and reproductive law. And I handed out the condoms on my campus in undergrad and like was involved in all these ways. I was a birth doula and I worked in an abortion clinic. So I knew a lot of stuff, but I didn't know that these criminal things were happening until I was in grad school. I was like, holy shit, like, how is this not part of the mainstream reproductive rights conversation? That these are like some of the most fundamental liberties. It involves all of the same legal issues as abortion rights. How have I never heard of this? I think the reason why I hadn't heard of it is because it's considered controversial, right? I think even more so maybe than abortion. Like the idea of a pregnant drug user, we hate these people. We hate these people. We don't understand addiction, substance dependency. We just don't. We don't have a trauma-oriented system of care. Initially, they were mostly targeting, poor Black people. And so we thought of it as a race issue and not a reproduction issue, which like, it can be both, right? So just, the whole thing, that's, I think, part of the reason that drove me to write this book is that I was like, how has this been happening? And like, I had no idea. And if I don't know this, I'm guessing like a whole bunch of people don't know this, because I make it my business to learn about this kind of stuff, right? So that was, kind of maddening to me. Something that I was like really surprised by, and it's something that we like thought was probably happening, but we didn't have evidence of it, was the crisis pregnancy center involvement. So, right, crisis pregnancy centers are these places. There's one right next to like a gun store in Indiana, like in Evansville, I remember seeing, right? These are places that will try to draw you in with like free ultrasounds, even if you plan on giving birth. I advise you to not go to these places because they aren't there. They might be wearing white coats, but like typically the people in there don't have medical training. They're not licensed to provide medicine. And we now know that they are willing to hand along your private medical information to law enforcement. So like if anything bad happens to your pregnancy and they know you went to a CPC, they can go there and get a bunch of evidence to use against you. Right. And if you are seeking an abortion, you should definitely not go to one of these places because they will lie to you and intentionally make it impossible for you to get the abortion you want and need. So having a confirmation of that was like, oh gosh, pretty rough.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a few more questions coming in. One person wants to know, will your new book discuss the idea of rights changing as pregnant people travel across state lines? Like, do you go that far forward into the future?
Yeah, I don't know that I mentioned it in the book. Maybe it's going to get peer reviewed, and so maybe one of my peer reviewers will want me to add something like that. I was writing a paper about it though that was like, if you did a cross-country trip, here's how many times your right to do blah 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 would change, right? If you're pregnant, because that's the thing about a federal system. When you let states determine what your rights are, it puts you in like you're in danger, girl. Like it's it's really scary. There were a couple of cases that I studied in my pool of cases where it was someone visiting from out of town who like went into labor early. And so now suddenly she's being subject to this whole new slew of like, oh, I'm not like fully a person in this state. Back home I am, but not here, right? It's really scary. It's really precarious. It's like one of the reasons why we're not supposed to let this really, really important stuff be up to the states, right? Because you should be able to travel and like remain fully a human no matter where you are. But that's not where we're at right now.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Kirsten LaFollette. I'm going to jump in because Stella has to leave, and I'm going to help wrap up our Q&A here.
Okay, cool.
So our next question is, what are your go-to sources to learn more about reproductive rights, problem cases, and efforts to ensure reproductive rights? That's one part of the question. And then do you have favorite websites or scholars that you would recommend?
It's great. I love National Advocates for Pregnant Women. They're actually just about to rebrand to have a more gender inclusive name. That's been their name since like the early 90s. So, but NAPW, they're great. They have a lot of good resources on their website. They have a lot of reports. They have links to peer-reviewed studies, and they're just, you know, they're in this fight on the daily. And so for any kind of developments in law or weird cases that pop up, they usually address them. There's also a great organization called If, When, How. It's if/when/how. And they also are a legal advocacy organization. They are especially focused on these self-managed abortion cases. It's another excellent website, and they also have a hotline. So if you have legal questions, you can call and ask them. And they have people who are like fully trained and like official who know the ins and outs of this law kind of technically. What else? I mean, in Indiana, there's All Options, which is an amazing resource. I mean, they're located in Bloomington. They have a hotline. They provide care. They also do stuff like diaper drives because like babies are expensive, you know, and we should have support in taking care of them. Those are great places to start. And then favorite scholars, websites, I like planc.com. This is a place, right? If plan A is not getting pregnant to begin with, plan B is you've had accidental, you know, potential pregnancy type sex exposure, you take plan B, and plan C is like when you need an abortion. So planc.com is a good resource, especially as abortion becomes less and less accessible, to help you find a safe way to terminate your pregnancy. We are not in the days of the wire clothes hanger anymore. It doesn't have to be like that. Even when it's illegal, it is possible to have a safe abortion. I cannot emphasize that enough. Abortion pills are medically safe and effective. So Plan C is great. There's another one, ineedana.com. It's another really good website resource for finding support in trying to access abortion, which should be your right. It's considered a human right, right? The UN says it's a human right. And then for scholars, Dorothy Roberts is my favorite. If you are interested, especially if you are interested in race and reproduction, which like I would argue are like inherently entwined, check out Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body. It is foundational reproductive justice text. She's a Black feminist legal scholar. It is shocking, it's heartbreaking, it's galvanizing, and it's super informative. And she like super schooled my white ass about what's really going on and how abortion's not the only important reproductive issue, right? Like people having their babies taken away from them is an issue. People being forcibly sterilized is an issue. And that this is something that goes back to the very foundations of really the founding of the United States. Like while we were still a colony, we were passing some really bonkers reproductive laws. So check that out. I love it a lot. She also has a brand new book about the foster care system and kind of how racist and cruel it is. There's also, put this up here, this might be of use to some of y'all, Robin Marty's Handbook for a Post-Roe America. This is the second edition because stuff changes so fast. It is like a pretty handy guidebook, especially if stuff becomes illegal in your state. So like, how did we get here is a chapter. Planning for your own emergencies is a chapter. Knowing your comfort zone, how to avoid surveillance, like it's handy. So I would recommend checking that one out. It's pretty cheap to get a copy too.
Thank you. That is incredibly helpful. And I think we've wrapped up all of our questions, unless anybody has any last minute questions that they want to ask before we wrap up. But that was really excellent. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. Denise, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, that was it. Thank you so much, Grace, for returning to USI to share your research, and maybe we can have you come back after the book is out. You could do a little book talk or something. So thank you, and thanks everyone for coming. And of course, thank you, Carolyn, our tech guru, for organizing everything. So yeah, just thank yous all around.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
And your virtual clap. So keep us posted, Grace, on the book and
I
when
will.
it's coming out
I'm
and all
thinking
that
like
good
a
stuff.
year from now-ish.
Yeah, stuff
I don't
takes a
know.
minute,
I
but
don't know how they do it. It's my first one.
about a year, but that'll be great. We're looking forward to it for sure. So
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming, y'all.
yeah, thanks for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And your research is important and interesting and disturbing and all of the many things. So thank you again.
Of course, of course. Cheers,
Thank you.
dears. Take care. Chins up, claws out.
Oh, I like that.
That was a good one, right?